Hello and welcome to Business Today Television. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Easynomics. On the show today, we are picking up a book that was written some time ago, Kautilyanomics For Modern Times, and the author, Sriram Balasubramanian, who is an economist by training, joins us today. Welcome, Sriram. Kautilyanomics, a book that delves into the fusion of ancient wisdom and contemporary economic challenges. I want to begin by getting you to tell our viewers, why did you write this book and why now?
Thanks, Siddharth. Thanks for inviting me on your channel for this show. And it's a pleasure to be here. That's a very, an important question, something that I get often asked. I think it's important to sort of highlight how I got into the process to illustrate the importance. I think most civilizations or most economic policies, frameworks, have some sort of an inspiration. For example, modern day capitalism is an offshoot of a Protestant ethic, and various sort of economic giants had some level of inspiration from the past to sort of derive their current economic frame. So while I was sort of working on Angus Madison as research. Angus Madison, for those who are not aware, was a famous economic historian. So he had produced this data set in sometime in the 2000s, which talks about economic history and for about 1,000 years. So he argues about GDP and GDP per capita and produces a data set that argues basically in very simple terms that from 0 CE onwards till about 17th century CE, India and China were the top two countries in terms of economic growth and prosperity. So this, while I was working on this for something else, this sort of really intrigued me because I felt that this sort of economic prosperity for such a sustained period of time, over hundreds and thousands of years, had to have some sort of a framework, some sort of a philosophy, and an economic philosophy that underpins this. So that sort of led me to the quest of exploring some of these philosophies. And of course, Kautilya's Arthashastra was one of the seminal texts that sort of provided an insight into this sort of thinking. So that led me to sort of study this. And while I spent almost 5 years on this subject, I was fascinated by the fact that so many of Kautilya's ideas, especially on economic policy,
Right.
is quite relevant today as well.
Sriram, India was an economic power, like you said, for hundreds of years until a decline that basically started in the 18th century or thereabouts. Why were we an economic power? Because this is a subject that a lot of people, describe in India. They say, "Bharat sone ki chidiya thi." So why were we so?
I, there are a variety of factors, right? I think fundamentally, in this book, what I articulate is that Kautilya's idea of what I define as dharmic capitalism is based on sort of three big pillars. One is the idea of a state which is rule enforcing but doesn't intervene. Another is the idea of engaging with the rest of the world. In fact, globalization was the norm for thousands of years. When I mean globalization, it's a broad term that I mentioned, but what I meant is engaging with the world, global trade. You could find, for example, Roman coins. The greatest density of, for example, Roman coins, besides Europe, was found in southern India in early CE. And there are various examples of not just historical evidence, or also anecdotal evidence by travelers, by Chinese embassy notes, for example, Greek travelers, who all talk about flourishing trade during that time. So, engaging with the world and sort of an economic model based on a sort of a global outlook was another important component. And the third component was sustainability, right? In terms of welfare, in terms of sustainable economic growth. These were sort of three pillars, I would say, which based on which such prosperity was built on. Of course, there were a lot of other thinkers as well during this time who sort of built on some of these models, and the foundation also of the idea of dharma beyond the state and the market. Because in contemporary macroeconomics, you have both the state and the market. Ancient India
Right.
worked on the idea of dharma, also complementing the state and the market. So I think these three pillars which I mentioned were some of the key components in driving prosperity during this time.
Uh, Bharat has been a cultural entity for thousands of years. But when we talk about the manner in which various territories were governed, it was mostly by kingdoms. Now, if as a country we had such a large share of global trade, and like you pointed out, what was the framework that kind of guided trade? Because these were principalities or kingdoms and kings who sometimes went to war against each other. Was there a common economic framework, a common set of sort of laws regarding import and export that worked, or was it each kingdom for itself, with the net effect being that trade terms were quite heavily weighed in our favor?
Yeah, that's one of the fascinating things, right? And they were at war literally all the time. I mean, the scale of war might be, the scale might be smaller, larger, and sort of, medium wars. But essentially, what you see is a lot of these kingdoms, and they were always jostling for political power. But despite all this, there was an undercurrent of economic activity which is happening irrespective of who was in power. I think that is the fascinating aspect, because irrespective of who was in power, they always had trade and commerce as sort of an underbelly, which is consistently going. So answering a question, they were indeed a continuity of policy across in terms of, for example, they were provided, a lot of traders were provided, tax exemptions. They were provided incentives to sort of promote trade in terms of travel, from one place to another within the country. They were provided, sort of, vehicles and support systems to travel goods from one place to another. They were also, what we call today as ease of business, was a sort of it wasn't called in that, that lingo, but it was there in policy where, the commercial traders were provided an environment which is, where rule of law was supreme, which means, they could, if they had any disputes, any dispute resolution, something similar to what we have, say in IBC, they could always go to and get justice. So there was a confidence in the system among the traders. Two, in terms of taxation, in terms of production incentives, in terms of movement of goods and services, they were always provided sort of support to engage, to trade within Bharat and obviously outside as well.
Right,
And
and we
three,
must, and I think the point that you also make, and for our viewers to focus on it, most of our trade, Sriram, was obviously goods, right? Unlike services,
right.
which constitute a very significant part of our overall export and engagement with the world, we were primarily dealing with goods. We were exporting a bunch of things, and we were obviously also procuring several things, including gold from all over the world, because that were the currency for trade.
Absolutely. In fact, there are accounts which say that the Roman current account deficit was largely dependent on the valuables and goods and services that we were exporting, to the point where, because there are accounts which talk about a trade between Rome and Bharat, how extensive it was. So not just goods. I mean, it's a variety of goods, right? I mean, you had spices, you had perfumes, you had ornaments, you had ideas and philosophies. Everything was sort of shared with the rest of the world.
Why did we
And
decline? Why did India decline? If we agree that the decline happened towards the 18th century, some people might want to argue that the decline started 200 years earlier, perhaps the beginning of the decline. Why did the decline happen in your view?
I think from whatever that I've gathered from my limited experience on this subject is that I think the what we call today as say Atmanirbharta, I mean, sort of a way of understanding and acknowledging our strengths and then playing to our strengths in terms of whatever that we are good at. I think that was something that you see along the way, where you would still engage with the rest of the world. You would still, have a flourishing economy which works the rest of the world, yet you have a self-reliant sort of an economy. I think besides, sort of other geopolitical factors, an important part is sort of understanding and recognizing our strengths and then working on some of these nuanced local strengths, both in terms of policy and in terms of execution of policy, which is distinct during this time across all these, kingdoms. I think that along the way sort of drifted away, and we sort of lost, I would say, our originality in terms of thinking, and because of other geopolitical factors, and then that led to a sort of a narrower worldview where we did not, sort of engage with the world, and that eventually led to sort of a decline. I think it's a combination of factors, but if you really look at it from a philosophical point of view, I think a lack of understanding our strengths and building on some of our civilizational ethos was one of the reasons for the decline. Mind you, see, in terms of economic policy, I think eventually all of us agree, whether it's now or thousands of years ago, we are still dealing with human beings and behavioral choices that human beings make. That doesn't change. The environment
Absolutely.
changes, the context changes, technology changes, a lot of other factors change. I'll just give you one small example. If you take the Middle East trade corridor, which Honorable Prime Minister recently inaugurated during the G20, if you really think about it, 1,000 years back, that was essentially the trade corridor that we're talking about, because most of the trade was going through these routes. In fact, there is evidence much prior to Kautilya, where even in Israel and much parts of north of the Middle East, you could see evidences of Indian traders and their imprints in all these places. So what I'm trying to say is that there is definitely a sort of a civilizational backdrop. Of course, not everything from the past is can be replicated, but obviously there are some lessons, indigenous lessons, behavioral lessons. How a complex, diverse civilization such as India, such as Bharat, functions, and I think these lessons could be quite useful for policymakers to ensure that policy becomes more effective.
What are those
So that you
lessons, Sriram, especially from Kautilya's Arthashastra? Are there lessons that are relevant in today's time and today's economic situation?
Yeah, there are quite a few of them. So, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. Right, one is taxation. Kautilya clearly argues that his understanding of taxation is between about 16 to 25%. Lower bound taxation is about 16%. Higher bound is on average within this range. So
Was he
he
talking
believes.
about taxes on income or taxes on goods?
I think he was talking about both, but primarily on income, right? So,
Well, that would
but
be music to the ears of those people who fall in the higher income brackets. But please continue to make your point. 16 to 25%.
right, but he also believed in the idea of Matsya Nyaya, avoiding Matsya Nyaya, which is basically the big guy, the big corporate guy, running over the small person. So he built inbuilt policies to sort of avoid that as well along the way. So he balanced his approach. So that was one thing on taxation. I mean, more importantly, on the philosophy of taxation, he believes that beyond a particular point, taxes become the law of diminishing returns take over. So he believed that it has to be plucked like honey in a way where beyond a point it becomes too sweet. So one is on taxation, another is on minimum wage, right? We talk a lot about minimum wages. I mean, in the advanced countries, but for example, in the US, it's $15 an hour. Even in India, we talk about urban and rural minimum wages. Kautilya believed in the idea of a flexible minimum wage. So, for example, if I'm saying, say, $15 minimum wage, that at 2% inflation is very different from $15 minimum wage at, say, 7% inflation, right? Because the real minimum wage is much different. So he believed in the idea of continuously assessing things like a minimum wage in the backdrop of macroeconomic indicators, and then evolving it to a targeted audience. So that's another example which I would give. And thirdly, I think the idea of behavioral nudges, which we again talk about in modern parlance, that's another area which I think Kautilya indirectly alludes to, what I call dharmic nudges in this book, where behavioral choices lead to more policy effective outcomes. So, for example, if you take Swachh Bharat, right, the scheme by the Honorable Prime Minister, there's a reason why it's far more effective in, say, rural areas compared to urban areas. In a very sort of philosophical sense, it
Right.
takes, because all of us are, yeah.
Sriram, one of the points that you spoke about, and I'm wondering, when in the initial years and decades of our republic, we had peak taxation incidence which was close to 100% of income, and in some cases even beyond that. And that obviously impacted industry, that impacted overall wealth creation, job creation in this country, and that those were the years of the big state. Our taxation philosophy has evolved from then on. We've also, in the term of Prime Minister Modi, seen both goods and services tax and a good cut in corporate tax rates. Given the present economic context, do you think an income revenue neutral rate of the kind that Kautilya perhaps spoke about is something that we can even aspire to?
Yeah, I think, look, more than the debate on the rates, the range of the rates, I think it's important for us to see the philosophy behind what Kautilya thought about taxation, right? As long as we are, I feel we could learn a lot of lessons from that philosophy. The philosophy is fairly simple. One, you have rates that do not have a diminishing effect, which means people feel frustrated beyond a point paying too much taxation. On the other hand, you also need revenue. So you need to find a balance between these two. And three is compliance. So if you want people to be compliant of taxation in terms of evasion of taxation or whatever it is, how do you sort of enhance compliance in a natural way? So again, the focus on compliance is another thing that Kautilya speaks about. And lastly, having systems that promote compliance, where people know that if you're not compliant, then you have consequences for lack of compliance. So I think
Right.
these sort of principles are what we need to aim for, or at least learn lessons from. And I think recent evidence suggests that the current sort of establishment is doing the right things, because you are the amount of revenue that you accrue from taxation is increased. Filing of taxes is so easy to do because you're able to quickly get your returns. Ease of taxation is also increased. So eventually, I think we, in a complex country, in diverse country like Bharat, steps are done in marginal sort of increments. And I think in some areas we've really progressed, some areas we're making progress. I think I would see all of it in a positive light.
Okay, one final question, and this is to do with the present. I wonder if there's anything in Kautilyanomics, so to say, with regard to the agriculture economy, or how to deal with the situation where in the present day the farmers of the country, and in fact not just in India but other places, are also aggrieved. They want more support, more subsidies, and they rightly so believe that they feed the nation, so the nation owes them quite a bit. Is there anything in Arthashastra that could provide any sort of guidance for the present time in this regard?
Yeah, I think Kautilya was quite a demanding person for the farmer, because he in fact he taxed the farmers and taxed some of their income. But of course, he is a political economist, so he saw economics as a way of political success. So obviously, the farmers are an important component of political economics. So I would think that he would sort of find a balance between having, because he believed in the markets, he believed in the functioning of markets, and he believed that markets eventually produced better outcomes for people from the farming community. Yet he understood the political realities of them as well. So I think one would be wise to, if you looked at what Kautilya, how he would have approached, I think he would have sort of made attempts to quell their initial concerns, and then gradually build upon consensus on building market-based reforms, which will eventually benefit the farmers. So that would be something in the long run. In the short run, I think he would try ways to sort of mellow their fears and try to find a solution for the moment.
The manner in which taxes were levied on farmers in the ages that we are talking about was also feudal. Sriram, you would agree with me. And when India was under the imperial yoke, this was a huge issue. Even before that, only some kings in history are known to be benevolent and not levy punitive rates of taxation on farm produce and farmers. I wonder if in the present time the real issue is really how to provide for a support structure for this very large mass of humanity in India, which is engaged in a very basic activity which is economically very important, which is food security for the entire nation.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, not just that. I mean, it's primarily sustaining not just Bharat. All the products that are exported outside Bharat as well. So I think it's fundamental to our functioning, and the scope for sort of enhancing their life is so high,
Right.
and the premium that market reforms can do is so significant that there has to be a way, at least in post-election, for us to take this message to them in a concerted way. One final example is technology. I mean, we all know how technology was sort of took its time to take shape, but post the pandemic, you see Bharat is completely transformed by technology, the digital ecosystem, and I think there is a trigger point which eventually comes, a catalyst, and one hopes even for the market reforms in agriculture, that there would be a catalyst somewhere which triggers this and provides huge prosperity for them.
Sriram, thank you for making this effort to try and explain the relevance of Kautilya's Arthashastra to the modern present day generation. Clearly, lots of things to note there, including, for example, the fact that you told me, which I wasn't aware of, which is taxing farmers, but obviously that should not be taken out of context and should not be in any way penal in nature. Sriram, thank you very much for your time and all the very best for your continuing research on this and other subjects. Viewers, if you've been, thank you very much for tuning in. We'll be back with more. Until then, do stay tuned in to Business Today Television. I'll see you again. Until then, bye-bye.
Darwin Platform Group of Companies is one of the fastest growing diversified Indian conglomerates with global footprints. It is setting up offices globally and tying up with companies across the globe for multiple sectors. The company has ventured into real estate and construction, stockbroking and finance, arms and ammunition, mining, airlines, and many other sectors.
Celebrate 32 years of leadership in business news with Business Today. From the groundbreaking AI cover of Sundar Pichai to PM Modi's exclusive on G20, we redefine headlines. Now our 32nd anniversary issue explores India 2029, the 5-year agenda, with industry titans sharing exclusive insights. So, just BT it for unparalleled perspectives. Business Today, 32 years of leadership, innovation, and business brilliance. Subscribe now. In today's rapidly evolving business environment, when risk is omnipresent, managing risks is no longer just about ticking a few boxes. Businesses need to maintain a panoramic view of risks to stay ahead of the curve. Join us to explore how organizations can rethink risk to unlock new possibilities and become fit for future. At PwC presents De-Risking the Future in collaboration with Business Today.